Well, my father, Benjamin Lefkowitz, got ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and which is a 2-year death sentence. And the first year, my father became very depressed.
He didn't just get sick and it was horrible, but he really didn't. He really had kind of a mental breakdown and was never the same. Because it isn't just, ALS is, as we all know, a terrible, terrible disease. And you have to make a decision at some point whether you want that trach tube. Because you can live a very long time, but it's 24-hour care, and you can't talk, and you can't. I mean, it's awful. If somebody like my father, whose whole life was bound up in biking and tennis and being the life of the party, and, but he really did, when they told him that this was a terminal diagnosis and the pattern, what happens to you is just awful. I mean, it really is pretty awful. It's not cancer where you can fight and you might win. I mean, or you can delay. This is palliative care. Even now, 30 years later, they're still not much better. I mean, this is a guy who had been, type A and I can handle it. He wasn't very sympathetic to other people who got sick because they just didn't suck it up enough. He would say that, So he really went from being sort of this I know everything guy to be basically followed my mother around the house for weeks, if not months, weeping. He was just a complete breakdown. So they put him on all kinds of antidepressants and that he stayed on because he really never, I think, mentally recovered. He didn't suck it up. He didn't, which you can't blame him.
When you have been diagnosed with with something which is going to kill you, that they know they can't cure, you're bound to react.
So my mother had to care for his depression, and the second year the physical problems became acute, and then I guess the depression then went away as he was bedridden. So she spent 2 years caring for my father and gave up her job, and that was very impressive too. My sister and I were out of the house at that time. We helped out, but the weight of caring for my father fell on my mother.
I mean, he had a lot of friends, she had a lot of friends, and my aunt was around, both aunts. Anne was there. Anne came a lot, I think. And he had a lot of friends from work who came. He had company all the time. People were always there.
So when my father was ill, the city of Palo Alto built an undercrossing at the foot of Adobe Creek for pedestrians and cyclists. He lobbied for this. And then he became ill, and the city of Palo Alto, in an act of grace, decided to name it after him. The Benjamin Lefkowitz undercrossing, and there was a dedication ceremony. And
it was very last minute because they wanted to do it, well, it was almost New Year's Day, and they wanted to do it before the year changed.
Yes, because...
So they were telephoning everywhere.
Because all these people on the Palo Alto City Council were going to be out of office in a few days, and they wanted to be the ones to make the presentation.
And, initially, it's a declining illness. So you start with just a little mobility, and eventually you're in a chair, and then finally at the end you're in a bed. And at the end, we were there a lot because, he kept almost dying, and then he wouldn't die, and then he almost died. And eventually he did die. And then my mom, pretty quickly, she started going on trips and, just to get away, right? Because she'd been basically, other than birding, she'd just been caring for my father for 3.5 years. I mean, she didn't complain about the having to do it. It was what you do. And he would have done the same for her.
So she cared for him for 2 years, and then he died. And then she found herself a widow with an empty house, and she had to reinvent her life. She didn't want to go back to work, so she volunteered for things and traveled and made new friends. And that was impressive too, because it's difficult to suddenly... You're not a couple anymore. You're single, and the man that you love is no longer, and who organized a lot of your social life and your daily life is no longer there. So you have to change your life. After Dad passed, how did you adjust to not having him or us around the house? Now
I can't answer that.
But you did.
Of course, everyone does in this situation. Sometimes I need more help than others, but there's no choice.
Some people can't make it. Some people...
Well, I had lost my father when I was just in high school, so I had experience in loss. And then, of course, we could see it coming for a long time.
Yes. You traveled a lot after Dad passed.
Oh, yeah. Well, I had, you know, that was very recuperative.
She started traveling, doing different kinds of trips to look at birds and some family visits, friends and things. I know she went to Canada, all over Canada. There was this trip to Israel and other areas around to look at birds, and then she saw family. And then she was in these birding groups. She did the Antarctica trip.
Well, I was a birder, if you remember, and there were a lot of birds that needed seeing, including in Antarctica.
But she also, like every weekend, she and her friends from her birding group, lady friends mostly, would go out, like in the Sierra foothills or just up in Mount Diablo, or, you know, pretty much every weekend, or somewhere south. So, and, you know, I think she, again, was in the book group, and she probably went back to the League of Women Voters, and because she was only like 60, my age, right, when my dad died. So it was a lot of years. And for a very long time, you know, did things, saw her. And then eventually, like, my aunt got sick, and there were, you know, but she was, I think without my father, she did manage these things, but he had been the organizer. And so she found these groups of friends, and she did these things, but I don't know that she was fully ever the same, and she certainly became much more fretful of a person. You don't see that now. That's what happens when you have no short-term memory.
Did you make new friends at this time through birding?
Oh, I always made friends in birding, because it's a sort of an intimate thing. You're standing next to someone, and is this a something, and is this a...
I only remember that you went to Israel and on the Antarctica trip.
Europe.
Where did you go in Europe?
I don't know. It wasn't particularly a trip for Europe. Maybe that was on the way to Israel, but...
I think maybe so. We'll have to
But
look
with some
that up.
stops along the way, probably.
Yeah, the trip to Israel, you went, and then there was a part with family and a part with birds.
Oh, I started visiting some relatives.
And then what was the birding trip? What birds would you see in Israel?
Oh, God, the wonderful birds in Israel. And of course, it depends on the time of year, because they come through, and what's the word I want? Coming from Africa up to Europe. I was there in the spring, so they were headed north. So it was very, very nice.
So then you came back, but later you went on the big trip to Antarctica.
Well, it was, you say the big trip as if I'd had one before. The only trip, but it
Right.
was a big trip.
And that was with people from this area, right?
Primarily, although I don't think it had to be, because it was a commercial tour.
What was the process of getting from here to Antarctica?
I think we went to Miami and then to Hellsbell, somewhere in South America.
Argentina.
Yeah, it was in Argentina. We had big steak dinners.
How long did you stay in Argentina before?
Just overnight. Well, you know, Argentina's famous for beef. We had the beefiest dinner the world has ever known there.
Tasty.
Yes.
And then you got on a boat, right?
When you get to the very tip of South America, there's a little line that comes down, you know, and one piece is Argentina and one piece is what?
Chile.
Chile. We didn't cross that line because we apparently didn't have the visas.
Do you remember how long you were in that tip, you know, the actual Antarctica?
Not long, overnight maybe.
Oh, but I thought the whole point was to go look at things in really the
Oh, no,
way
because we
south.
were going south of there.
Oh, so
Furthermore,
Oh,
well,
I see. So you're in the little tip. You spend a night, and then did you get on the boat?
yeah.
Was there a cook and they fed you meals?
Oh, heavens, we were on a steamship, a big boat, you know.
Then the boat would stop in different islands, and
Well-known stopping places.
you saw a lot of penguins.
Yeah.
I remember you told me that you were sitting and a penguin was nibbling on your foot. Was that true?
I was thinking about, well, what we really wanted was the famous emperor penguins. They're the great big ones. We only saw one of them. We had to work very hard to find it. Well, I can't think what kind the others were.
There were a lot of the others in your pictures.
But the other birds are not emperor penguins.
They were penguins.
They were some other smaller, slightly smaller type. But
Were there other animals than birds?
Oh, yeah. There's seals and sea lions. I have pictures of some of those.
And then you have the picture of your lady friends in their swimsuits at the hot springs.
Oh, yes. Not all of us had brought swimsuits for Antarctica, but a few of the ladies had. But maybe I didn't have the guts to put it on.
I suspect that was the case. And the people on the tour, some of them were birders and some were photographers?
Yeah. The serious photographers had their own intimate little group, their own table in the dining room on the ship, and no one else was allowed to be with them, who sat with each other at all meals and didn't talk to anybody else because their business was special. Once I sat at their table, and because everything else seemed to be taken that evening, and they weren't happy to have me there at all.
Oh, how terrible.
Yeah, I agree.
What did they talk about? Cameras? F-stops?
I don't know. They didn't talk to me. They didn't want to talk to me.
Well, that's terrible. I'm sorry to hear it.
Well, it was only one meal. But one of those we knew because he was taking pictures of us as when I say us, I'm talking 30, 40, 50 people.
But then there were people that were, so serious photographers, birders, and then just people who wanted to go to Antarctica?
Yes, you've got it. But that last group was the smallest. There were a lot of birders.
And did you know some of these people before?
Yes, I did. I can't think who.
But then maybe you met...
I met other people, of course.
Like your friend Lenny, who's been your friend ever since.
Is that what I met her? It was on a trip.
That's what you told me.
Well, then that's what happened. Well, you know, when you're on a trip like that, and if you meet people on the trip and they happen to be local people that you can get to know when you're home, as she was from Palo Alto, that's very nice, because then you can begin doing all the other things you do in your life with that person. You know, she and I go to concerts together and all sorts of things nowadays.
Most of the friends that we see these days are the birding ladies. Lenny Stovall and Alberta Jasberg and Danielson. Was she the one?
Well, she was my teacher.
Yes.
Marianne was my teacher. I got into birding in a knowledgeable way by taking Marianne's classes. And I was in her class for years and became a close friend.
But you joined the birding group here.
Oh, I always was involved with birding groups here.
So where would you go with them? You were going weekend trips, right?
Oh, there were all kinds of trips. There were day trips, you know, like for an afternoon or a morning. There were a few trips that were weekends where you went and spent a night somewhere.
And you go, where
But
would you...
they were mostly in Northern California. There were lots of birds in Northern California.
You had a list, right, of all the birds you'd seen?
Every time you saw a new species, you would write it down and you would say, give as much information about it as you could, its sex and its age and whatever, and where you were.
And that's your life list or your...
Well, it was a trip list.
I see.
And the trip list could maybe then, when you got home, it could fill in gaps in your life list.
I see.
I mean, if one of those birds was a penguin, it obviously was not on your life list already. Okay, because I never saw penguin up here. There was a note section, of course. Mm-hmm. Because if you drove 100 miles to see a single species and you only got one bird of that species, and that kind of thing happened a lot, you would note it.
And did people lie and say they saw birds that they hadn't seen?
What? Certainly not. Birders lie?
No, I wouldn't think so. But, well, it's really, you do it for yourself, right?
Yeah, and then you enjoy talking to other people with your interests. Mm-hmm. You have a notebook and a pencil or pen, and you write down what and where and anything else that's important when you see a bird. If you walked around the neighborhood here, you wouldn't remark on every robin. But once in a while, there's a special rarity here, and you would certainly mark it.
And then would you...
And you'd also make a phone call to the local Audubon Society so it could publish your finding so that other people could come to see the bird if it was still hanging out in whatever tree.
You were doing some kind of... They had these big nets, and they would trap the birds simply to band them.
Yeah, we banded birds.
So how did that work, the bird banding?
Okay. Well, they want to know in a given location what birds came and in what numbers and so forth. We had nets that were set up. You would have 2 big poles and a net across.
Way up high.
Yeah, I forget the exact height. And depending on the location, you had a whole series of nets. And if you were working on a given morning, you might have the job of going out from net to net and releasing birds that got caught in the nets from the nets, putting them in a little mesh bag and taking them back to the office where they were carefully identified, and you put a band on one of its little ankles. There are different sizes of bands for different sizes of birds, very, very tiny ones for hummingbirds and so forth. It has a number, so that you write down for your bird the species and the number of the band, and then you have its sex, if you can tell it, and its weight, and some significant measurements.
So you put it on a little scale, like a kitchen scale?
Yeah.
Did you catch big birds, like seagulls?
They could have, but that wasn't what this particular station did.
More songbirds.
Once during the period I was there, but not on a day I was there, they caught an eagle. That was just stunning to them, apparently.
An eagle is very big.
It is big, very big.
Flash or
But
crack
mostly,
out.
you might get sparrows and finches, warblers, hummingbirds, little birds that you hold in your hand. I was going once a week.
Oh, well, you went, I know you were recording the data in the computer, but were you actually going out and banding once a week?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Oh, if people were working in the field, they took notes on what they did, and then it had to go into the record books, and I did that.
Clerical work.
Clerical. I did clerical work. Everybody was everything. We went to get the birds, we banded them, we wrote the data, we did everything.
Okay. So I remember.
But, lots of the birds you get have already been banded and captured some other time, so you note that. And sometimes it's very interesting because the number on the band indicates this is a bird that was captured the first time far, far away. So you have something very special.
And then they would go through that process, and then they would let them go.
Yeah, as soon as you had done all the things, learned everything you could from that bird, you would let it go.
We'll go back a little bit. I should have asked this question at the beginning, but how did you learn about birds in the first place when you first got involved?
Your father and I used to go out on Sierra Club summer trips, and there were people birding on those trips.
Oh, way back.
Way back, yeah. And there were birding experts, and I was jealous of them.
Oh.
That they knew what they were seeing. And if you know a bird, you maybe know what its lifestyle is, whether it lives in the place where you just saw it, or whether it just popped up from South America or something. That kind of thing is fascinating.
And you never did butterflies, right? Just no insects?
No, I never did.
Oh,
You couldn't do everything in your life. You had to limit yourself.
that's true.
I go birding with her, and I have better eyes than she does, so I'd be her spotter, and maybe better ears as well. So she'd use me to spot the birds, and then I'd point at them and describe them, but she knew all the birds, so she could identify them. So we were a pretty good team at that. I never learned the birds as well as she did. And my father was a funny birder. He was always seeing these exotic birds that didn't exist. He'd pull out his binoculars and look at something, and he'd say, "Oh, that's an Arctic auk or something like that." No, they don't. They're not here in North America. Well, I think it is. Yeah. He was a funny guy. He was a funny man. They were a good pair. They were quite different. He was more gregarious than she was, and she always thought that he drew her out in a way that was good for her. He was a little braver and a little more adventurous, and she liked that. Yeah, they were very, very happy with each other.
And that my father encouraged her to go back to school and work, and thought this was fantastic. And both of them, I get, a life of the mind, and were interested in sort of intellectual things, and so we're excited to be learning new things. So, yeah, I think they worked really well as a couple. I barely can remember them fighting. I'm sure there were fights, but the few times there were, I was always a little kind of surprised because it was so bizarre to see it.
Once they met each other, they knew they were for each other, and they committed to each other very, very quickly.
But yeah, I think it was, amazing, because you don't usually think of this kind of, I'm going to marry you at the third date or the first date kind of relationships as actually working. But in their case, it definitely did. And so it makes me sad when I think, that they got kind of robbed of that. Because he would have actually loved having grandchildren. He really, I think. Now, he would have wanted them to do his things, but I do think he would have been excited to have had those grandchildren and have seen them, these boys grow up. So,
when was the first time you met my wife, Anne? Or future wife, Anne?
Well, you must know that better than I.
Well, what's your memory of it? What did you think about her?
Ah, wonderful. How can Matt grab this?
No problems with Anne?
No problems with Anne.
Good. Otherwise, I have to explain that to her when I see her.
She likes my wife a lot. I think she likes my wife better than she likes me. That happens a lot, I hear. They keep the in-law, they keep the daughter-in-law, and throw out the son. But yeah, she's very fond of my wife, Anne. That's a great comfort to me too.
Matt married, just me, I'm just me, so there's no seminal moments for me to talk about, but Matt's boys are amazing. I was a great aunt, thank you very much. I was awesome. I was the prime babysitter, spent a great deal of time with Matt and Ann and the boys. And we lived 10 minutes apart, which is just happenstance, but...
And my babies, my boys?
I like
Remember,
them.
do you
I
remember
like
Dave?
your boys. What?
Do you remember Ben's birthday up in San Francisco at the hospital?
Just before Anne went into labor, I asked my mother to be ready to come up to San Francisco.
Oh, that's right.
And we sat in the maternity ward.
We had an extra room for sort of socializing while we waited, didn't
It was
we?
a luxury suite. It was beautiful. It had great views of
Yeah, it was
park,
lovely.
And waited for Anne, and waited for Anne, and waited for Anne, and waited for Ben, and Ben wasn't
Well,
coming.
I left before that baby was born.
I threw you out.
What?
I threw you out.
Yes.
I told you and Pete and Pat it's time to go.
We went down Clement Street someplace for coffee.
Yes, but Ben showed up eventually.
This was our first baby, and we didn't know what we were doing. And I'd read somewhere that it's good for new mothers to have older matronly women around to tell them how to do things and to say, there, it's going to be fine. And so my mother packed a bag, and when the time came, she came up and spent a week with us and And when Ben was crying, he said, well, Mom, what should we do? And she said, oh, I don't know. It's been a long time. I can't remember. So, yeah, all right. Change the diaper, feed the baby, burp him. But it was nice having her around. And then after a few days, she left. And then the other grandmother showed up. And
Jacob came very quickly. You couldn't get there fast enough.
I do remember spending the night when Jacob was being born and I was babysitting Ben.
And then eventually you all came over to the hospital with a birthday cake. We bought Jacob a birthday cake because it was his birthday.
And my mother was certainly very excited. She was not pushing on anyone to have kids. She was not that kind of, they were great about, neither of them. You know, when are you going to marry? The kind of Anne Blackman Jewish mother, none of that. She was really a good mom when we were little. Like, she loved to play games. She loved to just, like, be with us. She was great when we were small. She did none of that with the boys. She was in her 70s, so she wasn't young, but she was perfectly physically fit and mentally with it.
I expected more babysitting than I got. Let's see. So, all right, here's a funny story. My eldest son, Ben, when he was a toddler, my wife and I wanted to go to see Big Game at Stanford. So we had this idea that we'd drive down and leave Ben with my mother and go to Big Game and have a day off. And my mother said, yes, no problem. And we brought food and diapers and the whole kit. And when we came home, my mom was in a panic because Ben had eaten everything, all of the express milk and all of the formula and everything. He was a big eater. And my mom thought he was going to starve and he was crying. And
We didn't give you enough food for Ben.
That's a disgrace. You didn't have enough experience with babies, but he was a big hungry baby.
We were new. We didn't know anything. Well, he made it. He's okay.
He certainly grew up despite any problems he had that one day.
That's right.
so we fed Ben and went home. But that was nice. We got the day off and got to go to the football game.
She was there a lot. We did tons of things. We visited all the time. She came up and visited all the time. And she would go watch Ben Row Crew and went to see Jacob in a play, and but
yeah, she was always a good grandmother, and she loved the boys and still loves them. But I was expecting more babysitting than I got. That's my only complaint. So about 10 years ago, my mother put a deposit down on an assisted living place in Palo Alto, Channing House. This was kind of an intellectual decision. This is what I should do so that when I decline, I'm not a burden. And then when the place became available, it was time to move in. She said, okay, that's it, I'm moving in. But she couldn't do it. She would go there, and it just wasn't right, and didn't like the carpet, and that got replaced. And in the end, she got her deposit back and walked away. And she's been living on Greer Road ever since. And so I asked her, why'd you do this in the first place? Oh, I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do. But I think that came from her experience with her mother's declining years and having to drive up. And she had to go there all the time, and she didn't want having us to have to do that for her. Which we are doing it now. At least my sister's doing most of it now. But Palo Alto is a bit easier to get to than San Francisco. And it's not so bad at all.
You used to say you didn't want us to have to care for you in the same way that you had to care for Dottie and take care of her.
I probably would say that, and I might say it now too.
There was some dementia, I think, and you tell her things that she forgets sometimes, and she held on to her car for far longer than I thought she should have, and that scared me. But if you suggest you give up driving, and she'd get upset because that would imply that she's no longer capable, and people don't like to admit that they're losing their abilities. She had the same problem with her mother when they took the keys away from the car from her mother screamed and yelled about it forever. And so this is kind of a recurring generational thing. Yeah, I don't think that's special to her. I think all seniors, as they lose control, they resist as much as they can. Especially especially parents who've always been in charge of the house, and suddenly they're having to rely on their children for things that they used to do themselves. It must be very, very difficult. I don't know, maybe some people give it up easily. They're looking forward to it, but I'm sure I'll resist the loss of autonomy and control when my day comes.
The mom that I knew when I was little, who was kind of quiet, she didn't talk very much. I don't remember. My dad was like the room, right? And me particularly, just like to talk. So my mother was quiet. My brother was quiet. And she didn't really, really she was a very quiet kind of person who was always nice to have around, but was not the sort of star of any party. She was, and but she always had a ton of friends. People liked her. She wasn't controversial, My father had a lot of friends, but I'm sure there were people who were not huge fans, right? Just because there was a lot of him to, either to take in. He was very good-hearted. And I think also my mother, she had a very big heart. She worried almost too much about friends and people being sick, and, that was really, and wanting to do things and help them, and, and then my mother, after my dad died, suddenly just talked all the time, almost too much. But, she really was just like, and I don't know that it was a positive or a negative, it was just different. And I don't know why. Some of it may have been that once her hearing started to go, when you can't hear, then talking is a way to, you either don't talk at all, or you talk all the time because you can't hear anyone else. I don't know, but it was just very peculiar.
She had a stroke in 2017, not so long ago, and apparently that zapped her the part of the brain that deals with short-term memory. Near as I can tell, she doesn't know things, and then she fills in the gaps, the holes in her understanding with what she expects to be there.
There's a lot of filling in of like stories or, this chair or that thing that are not true, but are done because there's a hole in her head, right?
So she says, I'm going out, I'm doing my shopping, I'm seeing people, I'm driving, and she's doing none of these things. And then if you suggest otherwise, she gets upset, and that bothers me, but what can you do? The part of me that wants to always set the record straight and say, this is the reality, has to fight the part of me that doesn't want to cause my mother distress. So you just roll with it.
And physically, for all, she really recovered from the stroke. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's hard to see her now. And yet in other ways, she's much happier now. I mean, if you can only remember things for 5 minutes, you can't really have a narrative of sadness in a way, right? You can't think, oh, I'm old and I'm frail, because nothing sticks. She can remember the old times, and she can take joy in doing the crossword puzzle repeatedly, right? And watching TV and, hanging out with her caregivers and her friends. But you're so in the moment all the time that in a sense, it's a little bit more happier. And she's a much easier, I think, personality, in some ways. Easier for her. I wouldn't wish it on her. I'd rather she not have had a stroke. But yeah, that kind of playfulness, it's something to celebrate in a way, but it is a function of the stroke. It is a post-stroke phenomenon. She didn't have that before. When I was little, I will say she was very competent. She was not emotionally always most sturdy. Like I was good at yelling, and she didn't deal well with that. But she was very capable. Like, again, if we were sick, she knew what to do. If the car broke, she knew what to do, If she didn't want to cook, but the cooking had to be done, she just came up with her system, right? In a nice way. She wasn't bossy. She was never mean. I don't think I could ever think of my mother as being mean.
The larger theme is that she perseveres. Their life throws changes at you, and she adapts. So some people don't do that. So I really admire that. When raising kids was not a full-time job, when we were old enough to go to school on our own, and she had a lot of free time, she did some new things. She did some things she'd always wanted to do. When my father died and she had free time, she took up the bird watching, and she volunteered at the so have you heard about the bird banding? She volunteered at the bird banding station and doing bird counts. And then when she was not strong enough to go out and sit in fields counting birds all day long, she worked in the office doing statistical work. So, as life changes, she adapted. Some people, they kind of brood on the way things were when things change, and that's not her. So that's inspired me. Things change in your life, and you have to change with them.
You're a great subject.
You're a great son.
I've run out of questions.
Okay, I've run out of answers.
That's it.